Australia's population is growing. It's more diverse and less religious. World leaders label a Russian missile strike a war crime, and the death of a billionaire who made his fortune out of sunglasses. It's Wednesday, the 29th of June, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Adam Lang.
Good morning, Michael.
Adam, does it feel at all like the days are getting longer to you?
It's at the margins, Michael, but I'm sure there's more minutes of light in the day, and that makes me happier.
And right now, we will take minutes. I'll take mere seconds of extra daylight at the moment. So I'm with you. I'm feeling pretty positive. Immediately after the show, stay listening because we've got an interview today with Calvin McDonald, who is the local boss of Scottish brewery Brewdog. Now, Brewdog came to Australia in 2019 and set up shop in Brisbane. And it's a good chat about how they plan to use the city as an export hub and really about the boom in craft beer over the last decade, which has kind of broken out of the mold of what you think a typical beer drinker is. So it's quite an interesting conversation. But Adam, the main story this morning, I know this is one that you are very excited about because you love your data.
I can't wait.
We know a whole lot more now about the Australian population than we did, say, 24 or 48 hours ago. Yesterday was, of course, Census Release Day. And in a nutshell, our population is growing with more people than ever before born overseas. Millennials have caught up to the baby boomers as the biggest portion of the population. And overall, we're getting less religious and more of us have a mortgage. Adam, it's a big day for demographers, for economists, for data lovers like yourself, and all of it feeds back into business.
That's right, Michael. We might feel like things are changing around us, but this gives us the data to know it. And it's a bit hard for me to know where to start because we're so spoilt for choice. Remember that this census was conducted in 2021, so it's a bit of a snapshot of where we were mid-pandemic. The amount of information can be a bit overwhelming, so we'll do our best to break it down. For example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics says the average Australian is a woman aged in her 30s, in a couple, with children. She lives in a greater capital city area and has a weekly family income of $3,000 or more. Now, one thing I also found interesting is that more people are identifying as Indigenous. So now more than 800,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were counted on census night. That's 3.2% of the total population and an increase of 25% since the last census in 2016.
Adam, 48% of people had a parent born overseas, while more than a quarter were born overseas themselves. The largest increase in the country of birth outside Australia was India, with almost 220,000 additional people counted. Now, India's moved past China and New Zealand to become the third largest country of birth behind Australia and England. And if you want more evidence of just how multicultural Australia has now become, more than 5.5 million people use a language other than English at home, and Mandarin is the most common.
So that's more than 20% of the population speaking a language other than English at home. And how well does that reflect our diversity? This is the first census to collect information on diagnosed long-term health conditions, and this is also a huge factor. And in somewhat of a worrying sign, more than 2.2 million people reported having a mental health condition, closely followed by arthritis and asthma. And as you mentioned mortgages before, Michael, in the last 25 years, the number of households with a mortgage has increased from 26 to 35%, while the number of people who own their own home outright has dropped from 40 to 30%. And considering the housing affordability and rental crisis, it might surprise you to learn that there are more than 1 million homes across the country that are unoccupied.
That is pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
I'm sure I could have one. Just for a little while.
If they're just giving them away, then I'll put my hand up. Look, so the question really is, where does this leave us? The overall population was 25.5 million people on census night, so it's more than doubled in the last 50 years. The largest generation group is a two-way tie between baby boomers and millennials. So each one of those making up 21.5% of the population. So millennials are catching up to baby boomers and passing them. So look out, Adam, we're coming for you. Are you a baby boomer?
I am not, Michael, despite appearances. I was born in 1969.
Well, yes, I had assumed that you weren't a baby boomer, but
you just thought you'd ask.
I saw a little opportunity for a whack and I went for it. Anyway, look, there is so much more to discuss, like where our population is living now, who's doing all the work, what's the outlook for our cities, what it all means for business. When Sean Aylmer's back next week, we're going to be joined by our favourite demographer, Simon Kusenmacher, who's right now sifting through all the reams of data, and you can just imagine he would be in heaven at the moment.
Oh, yeah. And I'm a little bit jealous and looking forward to the chat.
And so in the meantime, Adam, we need to keep moving. Let's have a quick look at markets yesterday. The S&P ASX 200 recorded its fourth straight day of gains. It was up almost 0.9% yesterday. The energy sector was the standout. Woodside was up more than 4.3%. Beach Energy and New Hope Coal were both up almost 7%. It was a good day for the iron ore miners too. BHP up 4.3%. Fortescue was up 3.8%, and Rio Tinto was 3% higher as well. The biggest jump came from Collins Foods, which operates KFC and Taco Bell. We'll have a bit more on that later, as well as another big mover outside of the top 200, the Tasmanian Salmon Company Tassal. There was plenty happening yesterday, some really good stories.
Yes, Michael. Away from the quick service restaurants of Collins Foods, it's interesting that the biggest drop on the ASX 200 yesterday came from the previous day's top performer, biotech company Imugene. It went up 45% on Monday, then came back 10% yesterday, which is a big drop, but not so bad when you put it in the context of this week. There's also been a lot of talk as well about skincare group BWX, which is backed by Andrew Forrest. Shares plunged more than 40% yesterday after they flagged a sudden downturn in retail conditions.
All right, what's happening on international markets, Adam?
Well, Saudi Arabia is apparently reluctant to lift output as wanted by the G7 nations, and that pushed up oil prices a bit to around US $111 a barrel. Gold is trading around US $1,828 an ounce, and the Aussie dollar's pretty steady at 69.2 US cents.
All righty, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Adam, it seems to be a very busy time at the moment in global politics, and Australia's certainly playing a role in that. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is in Madrid right now for the NATO summit this week. We've talked about that before. He's also having meetings with the Spanish and Dutch prime ministers. I think he is, in fact, the first Australian Prime Minister to have a one-on-one meeting with the Spanish PM, so there's a little bit of a milestone there. It's interesting that Australia is one of the 4 non-member states invited to come along to NATO. It's a bit of a demonstration of the increased focus on China and the importance then of the South Pacific as well. But it's also a sign of unity in the face of the conflict in Ukraine. And speaking from Madrid yesterday afternoon, the Prime Minister said Russian aggression must stop. He was condemning a missile attack on a Ukrainian shopping mall.
That's right, Michael. Initial reports were that 18 people were killed in the attack, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said around 1,000 people were actually inside the shopping mall at the time. Now, apparently there were no military targets nearby, with the regional governor describing it as an act of terrorism. G7 leaders meeting in the German Alps at the time called it a war crime.
And closer to home, Adam, we've talked a lot about the new Labor government's intense focus on relations in our region. How about this? Foreign Minister Penny Wong is now in Malaysia, having visited Vietnam in the last few days as well on her second trip to Southeast Asia in a month, considering she's also been to Tokyo for the Quad, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa and Indonesia, all since being elected last month. You cannot say that the new government isn't concentrating on our own backyard.
Isn't it great? We are absolutely supporting our cause everywhere. Well done.
Yeah. Now, on the domestic front, we've got 2 different stories on 2 different sides of the country today, Adam. New South Wales is facing a week of chaos, a combination of industrial action and environmental protesters hitting Sydney.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess, isn't it? Rail workers have been striking with train services reduced or cancelled, and nurses and midwives walking off the job at hospitals. Teachers are set to take action tomorrow. And this is all over an ongoing dispute over pay and working conditions.
Yeah, New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet certainly has his hands full. On top of all of that, Mr. Perrottet actually took to radio yesterday to describe climate change protesters who held up traffic in Sydney this week as dumb, divisive, disrespectful idiots. It sounds like he's had enough.
Yeah, that's as pretty sincere a whack as you're likely to hear. And contrast that to the situation in Western Australia, Michael. The S&P Global has restored the state's AAA credit rating for the first time in almost a decade. That followed the state reporting a $5.7 billion budget surplus in this year's budget, with S&P saying the rating reflected the budget outperforming domestic and global peers. So a bit of a cheer for Western Australia there.
And of course, you would do that because you are a West Australian at heart, aren't you?
I'm letting the data speak for itself, Michael.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now, I mentioned a couple of companies that performed very well yesterday for very different reasons. Let's start with Collins Foods. It was a very good day for the operator of KFC and Taco Bell.
That's right, Michael. Net profit rose more than 47% in the year ended May 1, and sales were up 11%. So that's a big increase in sales and margin. The company's KFC outlets in Europe are doing really well, and there is potential for pretty significant growth. What's the end result? Collins Foods' share price shot up 11.5% yesterday.
Yeah, but Adam, I think the most important remark made yesterday by Drew O'Malley, the chief executive of Collins Foods, was actually about the lettuce shortage, because apparently, he says, it'll be fixed in 5 to 7 weeks. Until then, however, burgers will continue to feature a unique blend of lettuce and cabbage.
Michael, do you think there's room for a lettuce index somewhere?
I'm sure there would be, actually, and I'm sure you would be the person to put it together.
A new economic test, the lettuce index.
The lettuce index. Well, I think if they are predicting that in 5 to 7 weeks the lettuce shortage is going to ease, the lettuce index may have a fairly short lifespan, I think.
Oh, we can hope. Bring back the iceberg.
Yes, bring back the iceberg. That is not something that you hear very often. And another comment that Mr. O'Malley made yesterday as well, menu prices are going up as well for the third time this year, and that is because material costs keep rising. Now, away from Collins, the other big corporate news yesterday was from the salmon group Tassal.
Yes, Michael, the Tasmanian-based salmon company has rejected a takeover bid from Canadian aquaculture giant Cook for $1.04 billion. It's the third attempt by Cook, which has salmon farms in the US, Canada, Chile and Scotland, and comes after it acquired a 5.4% stake in Tassal. Tassal's board said the latest $4.85 a share offer undervalued the company, which they said has an attractive independent future. Shares in the salmon group closed up yesterday 16.1% to $4.61.
And just quickly, while we're on equities, Adam, the Financial Review has covered some pretty interesting research by Macquarie into the best performing sectors over the last 15 US recessions. So this went back as far as the 1920s, kind of looking at the winners and the losers in the first half of a recession.
Yes, Michael, and for someone like me, you can imagine this data is fascinating. Staples and utilities outperformed 13 times. Health and telecom outperformed 12 times, while gold outperformed in 5 of 8 cases. On the other hand, industrials never outperformed, and diversified financials and basic materials only outperformed in 2 of the 15 cases.
And as always, Adam, a quick reminder that we are not an investment podcast and you should always seek professional advice before making investment decisions. Moving on, we are well into winter now, and it seems like we're starting to now see the expected spike in COVID cases that comes with the colder months. WA, for example, recorded 4,810 cases yesterday, up almost 1,400 on the day before. The ACT has got rising case numbers. Yesterday had its 5th record day of hospitalisations, and in Queensland, the chief medical officer is warning of a third wave hitting the state.
It's a good time to be getting a booster shot if you haven't already had one. In New South Wales, third dose rates are stuck at about 64%. New data from the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance that looked at 2 million people during Sydney's Omicron wave found that those who had a third shot had 65% greater protection than those who didn't, making them much less likely to be hospitalised or even die. So if that's not a great reason to get it, please consider again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Adam, we've talked before about the changing nature of the home lending landscape. Lately, there's been a rise in non-bank lenders. We even spoke recently with former Westpac boss Brian Hartzer about his own startup, which is focused on the bank of mum and dad.
That's right. And now we're seeing the other players in the home lending space becoming more aggressive in securing market share. Our friends at the media newsletter Unmade, Tim Burrows and Damien Francis, have done a deep dive into the advertising patterns of home loan providers over the last year. The top 5 advertisers have been, in order, Macquarie Bank, Athena, Suncorp, NAB and ING. It's pretty remarkable that only one of the big 4 banks features in the top 5 at a time when the housing market had been going gangbusters.
Yes, indeed. Now, moving on to overseas news, Adam, and a shocking story out of the US. At least 46 people have been found dead in the back of a semi-trailer in Texas. It appears to have been a failed people smuggling attempt with 16 survivors rushed to hospitals around the San Antonio area.
This is absolutely tragic. Police were called to the scene by a worker in a building nearby who actually heard a cry for help. The survivors were all suffering heat-related injuries, and you can just imagine how their conditions were as they passed away.
Oh, it's just terrible, isn't it? Now, Sri Lanka is in the grip of a major financial crisis, with the government there announcing a 2-week halt on fuel sales. It is the worst crisis to hit the South Asian nation since it gained independence from Britain in 1948. Government schools have been shut down and state institutions are operating with skeleton staff.
That's right, Michael. Fuel reserves have nearly run out, so it's being reserved for emergency or essential services. Sri Lanka defaulted on $51 billion of foreign debt a couple of months ago and is in talks with the International Monetary Fund about a bailout. The UN says that 4 out of 5 people in Sri Lanka have started skipping meals as they can't afford to eat. It's a major economic crisis, and it's all happening not too far from our Australian shores.
Yeah, and finally, Adam, I mentioned this story at the top of the show. The billionaire owner of sunglasses brands like Ray-Ban and Oakley has passed away. Now, this is a pretty remarkable story. Leonardo Del Vecchio was in an orphanage at the age of 7. He started as an apprentice when he was 14, and he eventually set up a pretty humble business making frames for glasses.
This is incredibly inspirational. His company, EssilorLuxottica, became the world leader in eyewear, acquiring household names and making Leonardo Del Vecchio the second richest person in Italy with a fortune of more than US $25 billion. He was still chairman of his company when he died at age 87.
Yeah, what a story. Now, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Calvin McDonald from Brewdog. It is all about craft beer, exports, and how a Scottish brand took off in Australia. That is coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Wednesday, the 29th of June, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.